The air in Chicago was thick with tension on that night in June 1996. Most observers thought the series was over before it even started, but one man refused to follow the scripted narrative of a sweep. Gary Payton, the trash-talking specialist from the Seattle SuperSonics, decided to do the unthinkable. He decided to get under the skin of the greatest player to ever lace up a pair of sneakers. In the fourth game of those finals, something strange happened to the untouchable Michael Jordan. According to official league box scores and historical records, the legend finished with a miserable 6 for 19 shooting performance. It was one of the lowest points of his championship run, and the reason was standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, whispering insults into his ear every single second. Fast forward to the year 2020, and the tension from that encounter has not faded an inch. In the globally watched documentary series titled The Last Dance, the world saw Michael Jordan literally burst into laughter while watching a tablet clip of Gary Payton claiming he had figured out how to slow him down. That laugh felt like a deliberate slap in the face to every basketball fan in the Pacific Northwest. It raised a question that has haunted sports bars for decades. Did Gary Payton actually find a crack in the armor of a god, or was he just another loudmouth who got lucky for one night? The footage from that era shows a level of defensive pressure that felt more like a physical interrogation than a basketball game. Gary Payton was not just playing for a trophy, he was playing to prove that no one, not even the man on the cereal boxes, was beyond his reach. But to understand why he was so comfortable staring down the king of the league, we have to look closer at the cracked concrete where his story truly began. Oakland, California, in the 1980s, was not a place for the faint of heart. It was a landscape defined by grit and survival, and for a young Gary Payton, the sidewalk was his first classroom. This was a time when crime statistics in the area were reaching historic highs, and staying safe often depended on how well you could talk your way out of a confrontation or into one. His father, Al Payton, was a local legend known by the intimidating nickname Mr. Mean. According to numerous biographical accounts and local news archives from those years, Al Payton did not believe in soft encouragement or participation trophies. He taught his son that if you did not let the world know you were there, the world would walk right over you. Gary Payton watched his father command respect through sheer force of personality and a voice that could cut through a crowd. It was here that the legendary trash talk was born, not as a gimmick for the television cameras, but as a necessary shield. In the rough playgrounds of North Oakland, being quiet was a sign of weakness that could lead to physical consequences. Reporters who later interviewed childhood friends of the star noted that Gary Payton was often the smallest kid on the court, but always possessed the loudest presence. He learned to use his words as weapons, distracting his opponents and breaking their mental focus before the ball was even tipped. This psychological warfare became his trademark, a style of play that felt less like professional sports and more like a street fight with a referee. However, this explosive temperament was a double-edged sword that nearly ended his basketball dreams before they could even reach the professional level in the early 90s. By the time Gary Payton arrived at Oregon State University, he was a walking controversy. He was a defensive hurricane, a player who seemed to have more than two hands when he was guarding the ball. On March 5, 1990, the prestigious Sports Illustrated magazine put his face on the cover with a headline that sent shockwaves through the scouting community. He was the best player in the nation, and he was doing it with a style that was completely unconventional and intensely aggressive. It was during this period that the world first heard the name that would define his legacy, the glove. According to university archives and sports media reports from that season, the nickname was coined by his cousin during a phone call after a particularly dominant defensive performance where Gary Payton held a high-scoring opponent to almost nothing. His cousin told him he was holding the ball like a baseball in a glove, and the label stuck instantly. He eventually broke every school record for steals, and the official tally of 321 remains a cornerstone of the university's athletic history. But even as the accolades poured in, the whispers about his attitude grew louder. There were reports from coaching staff members about his constant defiance and his refusal to turn down the volume on his verbal assaults. He was a force of nature, but many scouts wondered if a professional team would be willing to gamble on a young man who seemed to thrive on chaos. The 1990 draft was approaching, and while the talent was undeniable, the red flags were waving just as high as his draft stock. Behind the scenes, front offices were debating whether they were looking at a future Hall of Famer or a locker room disaster waiting to happen for a multi-million-dollar price tag. The night of June 27, 1990, in New York City was supposed to be the moment Gary Payton's life changed forever. As the second overall pick, he was the crown jewel of the draft, a savior destined to resurrect the Seattle SuperSonics. But behind the scenes, a storm was brewing over the staggering financial commitment the team was making to a 21-year-old who had yet to play a single professional minute. According to financial records from that era, the young star signed a 6-year contract worth $13.5 million. In today's market, that sounds like a bargain, but in 1990, it was a king's ransom that sent a shockwave through the locker room. The veterans, men who had spent a decade bruising their bodies for half that amount, watched the young man from Oakland walk in with a swagger that suggested he already owned the building. Reports from sports media outlets at the time described a palpable coldness during the first training camps. The Golden Boy tag was not just a title, it was a target on his back. Investigative reports in local Seattle papers noted that the established players were not just testing his skills, they were testing his sanity. They wanted to see if the kid with the $13 million smile could handle the physical reality of a league that still allowed heavy contact. Gary Payton did not help his own cause. Instead of playing the role of the humble rookie, he arrived with a fleet of expensive cars and an attitude that suggested the league should be thanking him for showing up. The tension was not just about basketball, it was about the shift in power that those millions represented. But as the season started, the shiny exterior began to crack. The high-priced savior was struggling, and the man holding the clipboard was reaching his breaking point. The pressure was mounting, and it seemed the million-dollar investment was about to become a historic failure. The transition to the professional level was far more brutal than Gary Payton ever anticipated. In his debut season, the man who was supposed to be an offensive juggernaut averaged a meager 7.2 points per game, according to the official archives of Basketball Reference. The numbers were an embarrassment for a second overall pick, and the critics were sharpening their knives. But the real war was happening inside the locker room between the rookie and his head coach, the legendary K.C. Jones. Jones was a man of the old school, a winner who believed in discipline and silence. Gary Payton was the exact opposite. By January 1992, the situation had deteriorated into what insiders called a Cold War. According to archived interviews with the coach in the Seattle press, there was a fundamental disconnect. The coach wanted a floor general, but he had a rebel who refused to follow orders. Rumors began to circulate in the sports bulletins that the young star was secretly demanding a trade, unable to handle the restrictions placed on him. It was a classic case of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. Though the glove was not just a defensive specialist, he was becoming a locker room lawyer, constantly questioning the authority of a man who had more championship rings than Gary Payton had sneakers. The tension reached a boiling point during a televised timeout where the cameras caught a heated exchange that didn't need audio to be understood. The city of Seattle was watching its future crumble under the weight of an ego that refused to bend. The experiment was failing, and the front office was faced with a choice: get rid of the expensive rookie or find a coach who could speak his language. Little did they know a change was coming that would transform the entire franchise into a powder keg of talent and fury. On January 23, 1992, the trajectory of the Seattle SuperSonics changed forever with the hiring of George Karl. If the previous coach was the voice of reason, Karl was the voice of the storm. He was a man with a reputation for being as volatile as the players he managed, and many in the media predicted a disaster. How could a coach who struggled with his own temperament manage a player like Gary Payton? However, the two men found a strange kinetic chemistry. They were both outsiders, both fueled by a sense of being disrespected, and they both wanted to tear the league apart. According to team records and historical reviews, the impact was immediate. By the 1993 to 1994 season, the team had surged to a staggering 63 wins, the best record in the entire league. But this success was built on a foundation of intense, almost pathological competition. Documentary accounts of those practices describe a gladiator pit atmosphere where the coach encouraged his players to go after each other's throats. George Karl didn't try to silence Gary Payton. He gave him a megaphone. The investigative lens into that locker room reveals a team that was as dangerous to itself as it was to the opposition. They were winning, but they were doing it on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The city was electric, the fans were sensing a championship, and Gary Payton was finally becoming the superstar he was paid to be. Yet, even as they dominated the regular season, a dark cloud was forming. Behind the highlight reel dunks and the suffocating defense, a financial jealousy was beginning to rot the bond between the team's two greatest icons. The stage was set for a spectacular rise, but the seeds of a legendary fallout had already been planted. They were the Lennon and McCartney of the hardwood, a duo so electric that they turned a rainy city like Seattle into the undisputed capital of the basketball world. Gary Payton and Shawn Kemp, famously known as the Sonic Boom, didn't just win games. They orchestrated a nightly highlight reel that felt more like a rock concert than a professional sports event. According to league protocols and official attendance records, the pair shared the court for 6 consecutive All-Star appearances throughout the 1990s, a testament to their overwhelming popularity. Gary Payton was the sharp-tongued conductor, and Kemp was the high-flying finisher who could shatter backboards and spirits with equal ease. But behind the thunderous dunks and the designer suits, a silent poison was beginning to seep into their relationship. The investigative lens into their private dynamic reveals a growing friction that started exactly where most professional divorces begin, the checkbook. As the decade progressed, reports from major sports media outlets began to highlight a massive disparity in their earnings. While Gary Payton was securing his future with astronomical figures, Kemp felt undervalued by a front office that seemed more interested in rewarding newcomers than loyal legends. The tension reached a fever pitch when the team signed a mediocre center to a massive multi-year deal, an event that many insiders believe was the true beginning of the end for the Sonic Boom. Those who were in the locker room in the mid-90s described a shift from brotherhood to business, where every pass and every play was scrutinized through the lens of individual worth. The fans saw two superstars in perfect harmony, but the bank statements told a different story. While they were busy arguing over who deserved the bigger slice of the pie, a far more dangerous predator was waiting in the shadows. The ultimate test was approaching, and it would either cement their legacy or expose the cracks in their foundation for the entire world to see. By the spring of 1996, Gary Payton had reached a level of defensive mastery that bordered on the supernatural. He wasn't just guarding his opponents, he was haunting them. That year, he achieved something that most experts thought was impossible for a small player in a big man's league. According to the historical archives of the National Basketball Association, Gary Payton was named the Defensive Player of the Year in 1996, becoming the first guard to claim the trophy in 8 long years. He was the spearhead of a Seattle team that felt invincible, a group of outcasts and renegades who were finally ready to take the throne. The world was waiting for the collision of the century. The trash-talking glove versus the untouchable Michael Jordan. In the transcript of a high-stakes press conference from June 1996, the confidence in Gary Payton's voice was unmistakable. He didn't just think he could win. He believed he was the only man on the planet with the keys to Jordan's cage. The atmosphere leading up to the finals was thick with a sense of destiny. The media was spinning a narrative of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, and the ticket prices for those games reached figures that were unheard of at the time. However, as the series began, something felt off. The aggressive, suffocating defense that had defined Gary Payton's season seemed strangely absent during the opening acts of the drama. Fans and analysts were left scratching their heads as the Chicago Bulls took a commanding lead that looked impossible to overcome. Critics began to wonder if the pressure of the bright lights had finally gotten to the kid from Oakland. But as the investigation into those frantic weeks reveals, the truth was far more complicated than a simple lack of effort. There was a secret being kept within the walls of the training room, a piece of information that would have changed everything if it had leaked to the public. For years, the narrative of the 1996 finals was that Karl had made a tactical blunder by not putting Gary Payton on Michael Jordan from the very first minute. But medical reports and internal team memos from May 1996 paint a much more harrowing picture of what was actually happening behind the scenes. Though the glove was fraying at the seams, specifically, a severe calf muscle strain had turned the most agile defender in the world into a man who was playing on one leg. The coaching staff knew that if they pushed him too hard, too early, his season would end in a medical facility rather than on the championship podium. This forced a change in strategy that saw Gary Payton playing a secondary role while Jordan ran rampant through the first 3 games of the series. It was a desperate gamble that almost cost them their dignity. The turning point finally came in the 4th game of the series. According to the official play-by-play logs, Gary Payton's defensive assignments were shifted, and he was finally unleashed on the legend in the number 23 jersey. Despite the intense physical discomfort, he managed to hold the greatest scorer in history to some of the lowest shooting percentages of his career. It was a Herculean effort that proved Gary Payton was right all along. He could stop the king, but it was a case of too little, too late. The damage from those first 3 games was insurmountable, and the dream of a championship in Seattle began to evaporate like mist in the Pacific Northwest. As the final buzzer sounded on their season, the heartbreak was visible on every face in the arena. But the real tragedy wasn't just the loss on the court. Behind the scenes, a conspiracy was already being hatched to dismantle the most exciting team of the decade, starting with a betrayal that no one saw coming. The golden era of basketball in the Pacific Northwest didn't end with a bang on the court, but with the scratching of a pen in a quiet office. By September 1997, the locker room that once hummed with the energy of a championship contender had become a battlefield of egos and bank accounts. The investigative trail leads back to a massive financial shift that many believe was the true catalyst for the team's destruction. According to deep-dive reports in major sports media archives from that autumn, Gary Payton secured a staggering new contract worth $87 million. While he was celebrating his status as the undisputed face of the franchise, his partner in crime, Shawn Kemp, was watching from the sidelines with growing resentment. The salary cap had become a wall between 2 men who once finished each other's plays without a word. The friction reached a breaking point when the front office signed a journeyman center to a massive multi-year deal, leaving no room for the raise Kemp felt he had earned with his blood and sweat. In a move that shocked the city, the Rain Man was shipped off to Cleveland in a 3-team trade on September 25, 1997. The news hit Seattle like a tidal wave, and for the first time, the fans began to look at Gary Payton with a sense of suspicion. Was he the leader who tried to keep the band together, or was he the man who let his friend walk away so he could reign alone? Those close to the situation described a chilling silence in the locker room that followed the trade. Gary Payton was now the king of Seattle, but he was a king without his most trusted general, sitting on a throne that was rapidly losing its luster. But even as the team's performance began to slide, his most dangerous weapon remained sharper than ever, and he was about to use it to cross lines that many thought were sacred. In the high-stakes world of professional basketball, words can be just as damaging as a physical blow, and Gary Payton was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the verbal assault. He didn't just play a game, he conducted a psychological interrogation that lasted 48 minutes. According to official NBA disciplinary records and historical archives, he accumulated over $500,000 in fines for technical fouls throughout his career. This wasn't just passion. It was a calculated strategy designed to break the spirit of his opponents before the first quarter was even over. Investigative reports and memoirs from players who faced him reveal a man who spent hours researching the personal lives of his rivals, looking for any vulnerability he could exploit on the hardwood. One of the most infamous stories involves a young Kevin Garnett, who was reportedly subjected to a barrage of insults so personal they involved his own mother. While most players kept their trash talk focused on the game, Gary Payton was known to drift into territory that many in the league found reprehensible. The glove became the mouth, a player who would whisper secrets and scandals into an opponent's ear while they were lining up for a free throw. Behind the scenes, coaches from other teams would warn their players not to engage with him, fearing a mental collapse that could cost them the victory. Yet, despite the controversy and the massive fines, Gary Payton never apologized for his methods. He claimed it was the only way he knew how to survive, a relic of his Oakland upbringing where silence was a death sentence for a career. However, this refusal to filter his thoughts eventually led to a collision with an old friend who was now supposed to be his superior, creating a scandal that the city could not ignore. By the turn of the millennium, the dynamic in Seattle had shifted from a brotherhood to a hierarchy, and Gary Payton wasn't interested in following the new rules. In 2000, his former teammate and longtime friend Nate McMillan was promoted to the head coaching position. It was a move designed to bring stability to a franchise in transition, but for Gary Payton, it was an invitation to a power struggle. The investigative records from the 2001 season highlight a series of explosive incidents that suggested the star player no longer felt the need to respect the man holding the clipboard. According to public press statements and team reports from that winter, a heated confrontation during a team practice led to Gary Payton's immediate suspension. It was a moment that signaled the end of an era. The man who had once been the heart of the city was now being labeled as unmanageable by the very people who had helped build his legend. Reports in the local Seattle media described a locker room divided between those who remained loyal to the star and those who believed his ego was finally dragging the team into the abyss. Nate McMillan, a man known for his stoic discipline, was forced to defend his authority against a player who had more clout in the city than the mayor. This wasn't just a disagreement over tactics, it was a public divorce played out in the sports pages every morning. The tension reached such a height that the front office was forced to make a decision that would have been unthinkable just 5 years prior. The glove was officially on the market, and the resulting trade would send him into a downward spiral of frustration and regret that he never saw coming. On February 20th, 2003, the city of Seattle woke up to a reality that seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. The man who had been the heartbeat of the Northwest for over a decade was gone. In a blockbuster move that felt more like a backroom betrayal than a business transaction, the front office shipped Gary Payton to the Milwaukee Bucks in exchange for a young Ray Allen. According to internal reports from the team's headquarters, the negotiations were handled with such secrecy that even the star himself did not know his bags were already packed until the news broke on television. For a player who had given his blood and sweat to the green and gold, this was an unforgivable insult. Gary Payton did not just leave a team, he left a piece of his identity behind, and he was not quiet about his fury. The investigative reports from that spring describe an individual who was physically in Milwaukee but mentally 1,000 miles away. During his brief stint with the Bucks, which lasted only 28 games, he reportedly refused to participate in the local culture and treated his time there as a temporary sentence. The statistics from that period, as recorded in the official league logs, show a player who was still talented but lacked the fire that made him a legend. He was a mercenary now, an athlete without a home, looking for a way to get back at the league that had discarded him. This sense of rejection fueled a desperation that led him to make one of the most controversial decisions in the history of the sport. He was willing to sacrifice his massive salary for a shot at the one thing that had eluded him for 13 years. The phone lines were buzzing in Southern California, and a plan was being hatched that would either save his reputation or destroy it under the Hollywood lights. In the summer of 2003, the basketball world witnessed a gathering of power that felt like a scripted movie plot. Gary Payton decided to join forces with Karl Malone, Shaquille O'Neal, and Kobe Bryant in a desperate attempt to secure a championship ring before his career concluded. To make this super team a reality, he had to take a massive financial hit. According to contract filings from that July, he accepted a veteran's salary of approximately $5 million, a fraction of the $20 million he was accustomed to earning. He was trading his wealth for a legacy, moving into a locker room that was already overflowing with alpha personalities and years of unhealed wounds. The press in Los Angeles treated the arrival like a coronation, but the investigative lens behind the scenes revealed a different story. From the very first day of training camp in October 2003, the cracks in the foundation were visible to anyone paying attention. While the public saw four legends smiling for the cameras, the internal memos from the Lakers front office noted a growing friction between the new arrivals and the established stars. Gary Payton was not used to being a supporting actor, and he certainly was not used to the strict tactical discipline of the coaching staff. Reports from sports media outlets during that season described a team that was winning games on sheer talent while their personal relationships were deteriorating into a toxic mess. The dream of a Hollywood ending was being overshadowed by the reality of four different agendas clashing in the same small space. It was a ticking time bomb, and the man holding the match was about to find himself caught in the crossfire of the most famous feud in the history of the sport. As the 2003 to 2004 season progressed, Gary Payton realized he had not just joined a basketball team, he had stepped into a war zone. The legendary conflict between Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant was reaching its peak, and every individual in the locker room was forced to choose a side. In his book titled 11 Rings, published years later, head coach Phil Jackson detailed the absolute chaos of that era, noting that Gary Payton often found himself acting as a reluctant mediator or, at times, a vocal critic of the entire system. He struggled immensely with the triangle offense, a complex tactical scheme that required him to give up the ball, something the man from Oakland had never been good at doing. The official records of those games show a significant drop in his individual impact as he became a ghost in a system that did not value his specific set of skills. The investigative reports from the locker room reveal an individual who was growing increasingly bitter as the season wore on. While the media focused on the legal troubles of Kobe Bryant and the contract demands of Shaq, Gary Payton was seen engaging in public shouting matches with Phil Jackson during timeouts. He felt disrespected by a coach who wanted him to be a robot instead of a predator. The tension was not just about the game, it was about the collision of two different philosophies of life. By the time the playoffs arrived in the spring of 2004, the four stars were barely on speaking terms. They were a team of individuals who were only united by their fear of failure, and that fear was about to lead them into a trap set by a blue-collar team from Detroit. The investigation into that collapse shows that the internal rot had become so severe that not even a miracle could save them from the disaster waiting in the finals. On June 15, 2004, the lights in the Palace of Auburn Hills dimmed on one of the greatest collections of talent ever assembled. The Los Angeles Lakers, the team that was supposed to walk away with the trophy, were dismantled in 5 games by a gritty Detroit Pistons squad. Gary Payton, the man who had sacrificed $15 million in salary to be there, looked like a ghost on the hardwood. According to the final box scores of that series, the legendary defender averaged a career-low 4.2 points per game. He was no longer the predator who could lock down any player in the league. He was a 35-year-old veteran struggling to keep up with younger, faster opponents. The investigative reports from the following morning were brutal, labeling the Fantastic Four experiment as a multi-million-dollar disaster that had crumbled under the weight of its own ego. In the locker room, the silence was deafening. The public divorce between Shaquille O'Neal and Kobe Bryant had reached its conclusion, and Gary Payton was caught in the debris. Reports from sports journalists who were present that night described a player who refused to talk to the media, his face a mask of frustration and regret. He had gambled his reputation on a shortcut to a championship, and he had come up empty-handed. By the end of that summer, the Lakers' front office began a scorched earth policy, trading away the stars and letting the veterans go. Gary Payton was cast aside like an obsolete piece of machinery. His dream of a Hollywood ending turned into a nightmare of finger-pointing and broken promises. He was a man without a team, and for the first time in his life, a man whose greatness was being openly questioned by the very people who once cheered his name. The next chapter of Gary Payton's journey felt more like a legal battle than a sports career. In August 2004, he was traded to the Boston Celtics, a storied franchise that he had no desire to join. According to internal reports from the Celtics front office, the veteran initially considered refusing to report to the team, a move that could have resulted in a massive fine and a permanent stain on his legacy. He eventually showed up, but the fire was clearly dimming. By February 24, 2005, the situation took a bizarre and scandalous turn. In a complex financial maneuver, Gary Payton was traded to the Atlanta Hawks, only to be immediately released so he could sign back with Boston as a free agent just days later. This loophole trade was viewed by many as a cynical manipulation of league rules, further damaging the reputation of a player who once stood for pure, raw competition. During his 77 games in a Celtics uniform, the statistics showed a player who was merely going through the motions. Investigative pieces in the Boston press at the time suggested that Gary Payton felt like a prisoner in a city that didn't understand his Oakland roots. He was a mercenary playing for a paycheck, his legendary trash talk now sounding more like the bitter grumbling of a man who knew his time was running out. Behind the scenes, he was reportedly reaching out to old allies, looking for one final escape route from a career that seemed destined to end in mediocrity. The once great The Glove was fraying at the edges, and the world was watching him slowly fade into the background of a league that was already moving on to younger stars. But just as the curtain was about to close, a familiar voice from his past offered him a lifeline that would change everything. The call that saved Gary Payton's legacy came from the sandy beaches of Florida. On September 22, 2005, the Miami Heat officially announced that they had signed the veteran to a one-year deal worth the veteran minimum of $1.1 million. This wasn't about the money. It was about a promise made by Shaquille O'Neal, who had moved to Miami and convinced the front office that they needed the glove to provide a veteran edge for a young superstar named Dwyane Wade. According to the team's internal training camp reports, Gary Payton arrived in Miami with a different attitude. He was no longer the primary option, and for the first time, he seemed willing to accept a role as a mentor rather than the center of attention. He was 37 years old, and he knew this was the final stop on his long, winding road through the professional ranks. In Miami, the investigation into his performance shows a player who had finally embraced his reality. He wasn't playing 35 minutes a night anymore. He was a specialist, brought in for specific defensive possessions and to stabilize the locker room when the pressure mounted. The chemistry between Gary Payton and the young Dwyane Wade was surprisingly positive, with reports suggesting that the veteran spent hours after practice teaching the future Hall of Famer the dark arts of defensive positioning. The Heat were a juggernaut, cruising through the regular season and into the playoffs with a sense of destiny that Gary Payton hadn't felt since his days in Seattle. The stage was set for a final showdown, a chance to erase a decade of heartbreak and silence, the critics who said he could never win the big one. But the path to glory was blocked by a young team from Dallas that was hungry for its own slice of history. The atmosphere inside the American Airlines Center in June 2006 was suffocating. The Miami Heat were staring into the abyss, trailing the Dallas Mavericks in a series that many experts believed was already decided. But for Gary Payton, this wasn't just a game. It was a final stand against a decade of heartbreak. On June 15, 2006, during the third game of the finals, the veteran found himself with the ball in his hands and only 9.3 seconds remaining on the clock. According to the official play-by-play logs of the National Basketball Association, he stepped back and launched a jumper that felt like it carried the weight of his entire 16-year journey. When that ball snapped through the net, the silence in Dallas was deafening. It was a shot that didn't just win a game, it saved a legacy. Investigative reports from the Miami locker room after that night described a player who had finally found peace. Gone was the screaming, trash-talking rebel of the 90s, replaced by a man who had delivered when the pressure was at its absolute peak. On June 20, 2006, Gary Payton finally touched the gold of the championship trophy, a moment that was captured by every major sports outlet in the world. He had silenced the critics who claimed his attitude would forever keep him from the mountaintop. But as the celebration champagne dried, a new and unsettling question began to emerge in the press. How does a man who has lived his entire life in the heat of battle handle the sudden, quiet reality of the end? The rings were on his fingers, but the fire in his eyes was starting to flicker, leading to a decision that would shock his most loyal followers. The official announcement came in the autumn of 2007, marking the conclusion of one of the most polarizing careers in the history of professional sports. Gary Payton walked away from the hardwood with a resume that few could ever hope to match. According to the official statistical archives of the league, he finished his journey with 21,813 points and 2,445 steals, a record of defensive dominance that remains a gold standard for every young player. But the transition from being the glove to being a civilian was far from smooth. Investigative pieces in financial journals noted that the transition period for athletes of his stature is often filled with hidden pitfalls and the sudden loss of the adrenaline that once fueled their every move. Behind the scenes, the man from Oakland struggled to find a new rhythm. He moved into broadcasting, but his unfiltered opinions and blunt delivery often put him at odds with the polished requirements of modern television. Reports from that era suggest that he found it difficult to watch the game change, often criticizing the new generation for a perceived lack of grit. He was a man out of time, a relic of a more physical era, trying to find his place in a world that seemed to favor politeness over truth. Yet, even as he navigated the complexities of his new life, a massive honor was approaching on the horizon, one that would force him to confront the ghosts of his past in Seattle. The ultimate recognition was calling, but it came with a heavy price and a public stand that would alienate an entire city. On September 8, 2013, the basketball world gathered in Springfield, Massachusetts, to witness Gary Payton's induction into the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame. It was the crowning achievement of a life spent in the trenches, but the ceremony was overshadowed by a controversy that reached far beyond the walls of the museum. During his press availability and his official speech, the Glove made a public declaration that sent shockwaves through the league office. He flatly refused to acknowledge the Oklahoma City Thunder as the heirs to his legacy, insisting that his history belonged exclusively to the city of Seattle. This wasn't just a sentimental gesture, it was a calculated act of defiance against the business of the sport. Investigative reports in the sports media highlighted the deep-seated bitterness Gary Payton felt toward the move that had stripped Seattle of its team in 2008. He became a vocal leader in the movement to bring professional basketball back to the Northwest, often appearing at public rallies and in legal discussions. He was a man of principle, but his unwavering loyalty came at a time when his own private world was beginning to show signs of strain. While he was fighting for the soul of a city, whispers were starting to circulate about his own personal choices and the management of the massive fortune he had accumulated during his playing days. Rumors of failed business ventures and a lifestyle that rivaled the excess of his youth began to surface, leading many to wonder if the man who could lock down any opponent was finally losing his grip on his own reality. The glittering world of professional basketball often masks a harsh financial reality that many legends struggle to navigate once the cheering stops. For Gary Payton, the numbers were once astronomical, painting a picture of a man who would never have to worry about a bank statement again. According to the comprehensive financial archives of SpotTrack, the defensive specialist earned a staggering career total of over $104 million in salary alone. This figure does not even account for the massive endorsement deals with global athletic brands that pushed his wealth into a different stratosphere. However, investigative reports into his lifestyle during the late 90s and early 2000 units revealed a pattern of spending that would make even a billionaire blink. Public real estate records and luxury automotive journals documented a collection of more than 20 high-end vehicles and multiple sprawling estates in Las Vegas and his hometown of Oakland. The whispers in the financial corridors of the league suggested that the Glove was living at a pace that few could maintain. There were reports of high-stakes gambling and investments in business ventures that never quite reached their potential. For a man who built his reputation on being disciplined on the court, his private accounting seemed to follow a much more chaotic script. While many of his contemporaries were facing public bankruptcies, Gary Payton managed to keep his head above water, but the cost was a constant cycle of appearances and media work to maintain the cash flow. This struggle for financial stability and the weight of his own legacy created a high-pressure environment for his family, especially for his namesake. The investigation into the next generation of the Payton household reveals a story of a young man who had to fight through the luxury and the expectations to find his own worth. Growing up as the son of a Hall of Fame icon is often described as a blessing, but for Gary Payton II, it felt more like a relentless trial. The elder Payton was notoriously hard on his son, employing the same trash talk and mental pressure that he used to break the spirits of his NBA rivals. This was not a story of a silver spoon. It was a story of a young man who was told he wasn't good enough to carry the family name. According to official league transaction logs, the younger Payton was forced to navigate the professional landscape through a grueling series of 10-day contracts and stints in the developmental league. He played for 6 different NBA franchises before he finally found a place that valued his specific talents, a journey that many insiders believe was made harder by the towering reputation of his father. The investigative look at their relationship shows a dynamic built on tough love that nearly reached a breaking point several times. While the media saw a proud father, those in the inner circle described a man who refused to give his son an easy path. The payoff for this brutal upbringing finally arrived on June 16, 2022. On that night, the younger Payton secured his own championship ring with the Golden State Warriors, a moment that was captured by broadcast cameras as the elder legend watched from the stands with a rare look of silent approval. He had finally stepped out of the shadow and into his own light, proving that the Payton grit was a biological trait. But even as the family celebrated this new triumph, a ghost from the past was waiting to drag the glove back into a public war of words. A simple interview about the greatest of all time was about to reignite a rivalry that has spanned 3 decades. Decades after the final buzzer of the 1996 finals, the tension between Gary Payton and Michael Jordan remains one of the most discussed topics in the history of the sport. The fire was reignited in 2020 when the documentary series titled The Last Dance showed Jordan laughing at the suggestion that the glove had truly bothered him. This public dismissal did not sit well with the man from Oakland. In numerous appearances on sports podcasts and in transcripts from his own digital media segments, Gary Payton has maintained that he was the only defender who ever made the Air legend feel human. He points to the Game 4 statistics as his primary evidence, where he held the icon to a miserable shooting performance of 6 for 19, a fact that remains a permanent stain on an otherwise perfect championship run. The investigative analysis of their current relationship reveals a deep-seated professional respect masked by a layer of competitive arrogance. While Jordan sits on a throne of 6 rings, Gary Payton continues to be ranked as the number 2 defensive guard of all time in historical lists compiled by outlets like ESPN. He refuses to back down, often stating in recent interviews that if they played in today's more restricted league, he would have locked him up even more effectively. This isn't just about old games. It's about the narrative of who was truly the most dominant force of that golden era. Gary Payton remains the loud, defiant voice of the underdog, a man who built a career on saying the things that others were too afraid to whisper. As he looks back on a journey filled with millions of dollars, intense scandals, and the ultimate redemption, one question remains. Was the price of being the most hated man in the arena worth the legend he left behind? As the dust settles on one of the most explosive and debated careers in the history of the sport, the final verdict on Gary Payton remains as complex as the man himself. We have followed his journey from the unforgiving concrete of North Oakland to the absolute pinnacle of global fame, witnessing a transformation that few believed was possible. He was the man who dared to challenge the untouchable legends of the '96 era, a player who used his voice as a weapon of psychological destruction, and a survivor who finally secured his golden moment in the sunset of his career. According to the comprehensive financial archives of SpotRack, the glove accumulated a staggering career total of approximately $104 million in salary alone. This figure stands as a permanent testament to his value in an era of giants, proving that a relentless spirit and a sharp tongue can be just as profitable as a 7-foot frame. Today, the investigation into his life reveals a man who has traded the fury of the locker room for the strategic role of a mentor and a community pillar. In February 2026, the basketball world watched as Gary Payton was officially named as an assistant coach for the Seattle SuperHawks, a move that signals his enduring commitment to the game and his desire to shape the next generation of athletes. He is no longer just a critic from the sidelines. He is back in the trenches, teaching the same defensive secrets that once made Michael Jordan stop and take notice. But perhaps the most intriguing thread of this investigation is his ongoing war to restore the pride of the Pacific Northwest. Throughout the early months of 2026, Gary Payton has been a vocal leader in high-level discussions regarding the return of the SuperSonics to Seattle. With the league office signaling that a final determination on expansion will be made later in 2026, the man who once felt betrayed by the city's loss is now the primary architect of its potential resurrection. Ultimately, the story of Gary Payton is a story about the power of authenticity. In a world of carefully polished public relations and safe, scripted answers, he chose the path of raw, unvarnished truth. He wasn't always a hero, and he certainly wasn't always a saint, but he was always undeniably himself. Whether he was donating his time through the Gary Payton Glove Foundation or helping his son navigate the pressures of a famous name, he remained a force of nature that refused to be silenced. As we look at his place in the Hall of Fame, we see more than just a collection of steals and points. We see the legacy of a man who proved that you don't have to be quiet to be respected. The glove may have officially come off years ago, but the impact of his grip on the game will be felt for as long as the ball continues to bounce. He remains the ultimate investigator of his opponent's weaknesses, leaving us with a final, lingering thought. In the end, it wasn't just his defense that locked people up, it was the undeniable power of a man who never, ever stopped talking.